Vancouver blizzard, the wind howling like it wants to rip your soul apart, and all you've got is a set of rusted, worthless keys to a broken-down truck. My family, my own flesh and blood, stood in their glittering West Vancouver mansion, their faces twisted with disgust, and hurled those keys at me like I was nothing. "You're a stain on this family," they spat, their words slicing through me like shrapnel. "Take your pathetic truck and disappear." They didn't just betray me, they obliterated me, handing every dollar of our legacy, the sprawling estate, the Okanagan Lake House, the Fraser Empire, to my sister and her vile, gloating husband. Me? I got a 1985 Chevrolet Silverado, a cruel joke meant to grind my heart into dust. The pain is a living thing, clawing at my chest, screaming that I'm worthless. It hurts so much I can barely breathe. But through the agony, a fire ignites, pure, searing rage. They think they've crushed me. They're wrong. Those keys are my weapon, and their betrayal is my war cry. I'm Captain Lauren Mackenzie. I'm 34 years old. I've stared death in the face in hellholes you'll never know. And I'm coming for justice. The snowstorm outside the Fraser family's West Vancouver mansion raged on, a howling beast battering the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the warmth of the cedar-paneled living room, with its roaring fireplace and the faint scent of pine from a towering Christmas tree, felt like a cruel lie. I stood there, Captain Lauren Mackenzie, 34 years old, fresh off a plane from CFB Trenton after a grueling tour in Mali. My combat boots still carried the dust of places most Canadians only see on the news. I'd come home expecting a Christmas reunion, maybe a sliver of warmth after years of dodging bullets in deserts half a world away. Instead, I walked into a tribunal. My family sat across from me, a united front of cold indifference, their eyes judging me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their perfect world. My father, Edward Fraser, CEO of Fraser Enterprises, a real estate empire that owned half the condos in downtown Vancouver, lounged in a leather armchair. He flipped through a copy of the Globe and Mail, his face a mask of calculated disinterest. My mother, Margaret, sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the polished hardwood floor as if it held the secrets to avoiding this moment. My sister, Olivia Bennett, a rising star at a top-tier Vancouver law firm, adjusted her cashmere sweater with a smug grace, her lips curling into a faint, predatory smile. Her husband, Ethan Bennett, a venture capitalist with a smirk as sharp as his tailored suit, leaned back, checking his phone with an air of bored superiority. They weren't just a family, they were a fortress, and I was the outsider. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a grandfather clock. Then James Carter, our family lawyer, a man I'd known since I was a kid, cleared his throat. His voice trembled as he unfolded my grandfather's will, General Alistair Fraser's final words. As per the last will and testament, he began, his eyes avoiding mine, the West Vancouver estate valued at $15 million, the Okanagan Lake House, and the controlling shares of Fraser Enterprises are bequeathed to Olivia Bennett and Ethan Bennett. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart pounded, but I kept my face stone cold, a discipline carved into me by years of training. James hesitated, then continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. To Captain Lauren Mackenzie, General Fraser leaves his 1985 Chevrolet Silverado, parked in the garage. The room froze. Ethan let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the cedar walls. He stood, grabbed the rusted keys from James's desk, and flung them at me. They skittered across the floor, stopping just short of my boots. Here's your inheritance, soldier, he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Take your junk heap and get out of our sight. You're no Fraser. Olivia's smile widened, a silent agreement. Edward didn't look up from his paper, but his jaw tightened, a signal of approval. Margaret's hands clenched harder, her knuckles white, but she said nothing. The betrayal wasn't just in the will, it was in their eyes, their silence, their utter dismissal of everything I'd fought for. I bent down, my movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the keys. The cold metal bit into my palm, but my hand didn't shake. I stood tall, my spine forged in the crucible of war, and locked eyes with Ethan. You think this ends here? I said, my voice low, steady, a blade of its own. "You're wrong." I turned and walked out, the weight of their stares burning into my back. The keys weren't just metal, they were a challenge, a spark. And I was ready to ignite. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked away from the Fraser family's West Vancouver mansion, the rusted keys of the 1985 Chevrolet Silverado burning like a brand in my clenched fist. The storm howled around me, the wind cutting through my jacket, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the icy betrayal that gripped my heart. I climbed into the truck, the cracked vinyl seat creaking under my weight. The cab smelled of old motor oil, faded leather, and the faint, lingering ghost of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. It was General Alistair Fraser's truck, his sanctuary, and now it was mine, a final, bitter gift. As I sat there, the weight of my family's rejection pressed down on me, heavier than the 2 feet of snow piling up outside. My mind drifted back, unbidden, to the memories that shaped me, the ones that made this moment hurt so deeply it felt like my soul was bleeding. I was 10 years old, standing on the dock of our family's Okanagan lake house, the summer sun glinting off the water like a sheet of gold. My grandfather, General Alistair Fraser, stood beside me, his calloused hands guiding mine as I clumsily cast a fishing line. His deep, gravelly voice was warm with patience. "Steady, Lauren," he said, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "It's not about the fish, it's about knowing you can wait out the toughest storms." He was a giant to me, not just in stature but in presence, a retired Canadian Forces general who'd seen wars I could barely imagine. While my father, Edward Fraser, built his real estate empire in Vancouver, Alistair taught me about honor, courage, and the kind of strength that didn't come from money. He was the only one who saw me, not as a disappointment, but as a spark ready to ignite. The memory shifted, sharp and jagged, to a Christmas dinner in our West Vancouver home when I was 16. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the table heavy with crystal glasses and my mother Margaret's famous maple-glazed ham. My sister, Olivia, radiant in a red dress, unwrapped a sleek new laptop from Edward, his face beaming with pride. "For our future lawyer," he said, clapping her shoulder. "UBC's law program won't know what hit it." The room erupted in applause, but when it was my turn, the air turned cold. I tore open a box to find a pair of neon pink boxing gloves, a clumsy jab at my love for martial arts. Edward's voice was laced with condescension. "Maybe these will make you a bit more ladylike, Lauren. No husband wants a wife who fights like a man." Olivia's laughter cut like glass, and Margaret's quick change of subject, "Edward, dear, more wine?" was a silent agreement with his scorn. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my hands trembling under the table, and excused myself to the basement gym, where I punched a bag until my knuckles bled, not from anger, but from a bone-deep sorrow I couldn't name. The final memory hit me like a mortar round. I was 18, standing in the same dining room, my heart pounding as I announced my decision to enlist in the Canadian Forces, inspired by Alistair's stories of service. The room exploded. Edward slammed his fist on the table, the antique china rattling. "You're throwing away your life," he roared, his face purple with rage. "I paid for the best schools in British Columbia, and you choose to be cannon fodder? You're a disgrace to the Fraser name." Margaret's tears fell silently, her hands wringing a napkin to shreds, but she said nothing, her silence a betrayal sharper than words. Olivia stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her eyes glinting with smug pity. "Some people just aren't cut out for greatness, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with superiority. Only Alistair, who'd driven 300 kilometers through a snowstorm from Kelowna, stood up. His presence silenced the room like a command. "Serving this country is the highest honor, Edward," he said, his voice steel. He turned to me, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Go, Lauren. Be the woman I know you are." His belief was my lifeline, the only thing that kept me from breaking. I gripped the steering wheel of the truck, the memories burning hotter than the rage from Ethan's thrown keys. My family's rejection wasn't new, it was a wound they'd been carving into me since childhood. But Alistair's love, his unwavering faith, was the shield that kept me whole. Those keys weren't just an insult, they were his final message, a call to fight. And I would. The blizzard had swallowed West Vancouver whole, blanketing the Fraser family's manicured estate in a relentless curtain of white. I drove the 1985 Chevrolet Silverado through the storm, its engine coughing and sputtering like it was as furious as I was. The rusted keys Ethan Bennett had thrown at me, meant as a final humiliation, were still warm in my pocket, a jagged reminder of the betrayal that had just unfolded in that cedar-paneled living room. My family, Edward Fraser, Margaret, Olivia Bennett, and her smug husband Ethan, had stripped me of my grandfather's legacy, handing millions in assets to Olivia and Ethan while I got this beat-up truck. But as I gripped the steering wheel, the faint scent of General Alistair Fraser's pipe tobacco lingering in the cab, I felt a flicker of something sharper than rage, purpose. This truck wasn't just an insult. It was a message, and I was damn well going to decode it. I pulled into a rented cabin in Whistler, 120 kilometers north of Vancouver, a bare-bones refuge tucked among snow-laden pines. The wind screamed outside, rattling the single-pane windows, but inside, the silence was heavier. I sat on the edge of a creaky cot, the truck's keys in one hand, my mind racing. My grandfather, Alistair, wasn't a man who did things by accident. Every order he gave in his military days was precise, deliberate. This truck had to mean something. I climbed back into the cab, the cold vinyl biting through my jeans, and started searching. The dashboard was scratched, the radio long dead, but when I opened the glove compartment, my breath caught. Beneath a tattered map of British Columbia, folded and yellowed with age, was a small black USB drive, its surface scuffed but intact. My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't random. This was Alistair's move, his final play. I plugged the USB into my battered laptop, the cabin's dim lantern casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The drive held a single audio file, labeled AF_statement. I clicked play, and my grandfather's voice filled the room, frail from illness but unyielding, like a general issuing orders from a hospital bed. "This is not what I agreed to," he said, his words clipped with indignation. "I will not change my will now. They can't force me." The recording cut off, abrupt and chilling, leaving a silence that roared louder than the storm outside. My hands shook, not from the cold but from the realization crashing over me. Alistair had known. He'd known they were trying to rewrite his legacy, to erase me. This USB was his counterattack, hidden in the one place my family would never look, a truck they saw as worthless. I needed help, someone I could trust with my life, because this was starting to feel like a battlefield. My fingers hesitated over my phone before dialing Ryan Mitchell, a former Canadian Forces Signals Intelligence specialist who'd saved my ass in a firefight in Kandahar. Now running a cybersecurity firm in Toronto, 3,400 kilometers away, Ryan was the kind of soldier who never left a comrade behind. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm but alert, like he was still on a mission. "Captain Mackenzie," he said, the respect in his tone grounding me. "Sit rep." I laid it out, my voice steady despite the fury churning inside, the will, the truck, the USB, Alistair's voice. I didn't need to explain the betrayal, Ryan heard it in the cracks of my words. "Send me the file," he said, no hesitation. "Encrypted channel. I'll dig into it. No charge." I started to protest, but he cut me off, his voice dropping to a growl. "Lauren, you took a bullet for my team in Afghanistan. This isn't a favor, it's what we do. Besides, I hate rich bullies who think they can buy their way out of everything." I sent the file, my fingers moving with the precision of a soldier assembling a rifle. Ryan's words echoed in my head, a reminder of the family I'd found in the forces, the kind that didn't spit in your face and call it love. The USB wasn't just a clue, it was a grenade, and I was ready to pull the pin. Alistair had left me a weapon, and I was going to use it to blow their lies wide open. The war had just begun, and I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was Captain Lauren Mackenzie, and I was coming for the truth. The Whistler cabin was a fortress of solitude, its wooden walls groaning under the weight of the relentless British Columbia blizzard. I sat hunched over my laptop, the glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across my face, General Alistair Fraser's voice still echoing in my ears from the USB I'd found in his 1985 Chevrolet Silverado. "This is not what I agreed to," he'd said, his words a battle cry from beyond the grave. My family, Edward Fraser, Margaret, Olivia Bennett, and her snake of a husband, Ethan, hadn't just betrayed me, they'd defiled Alistair's legacy, rewriting his will to cut me out of the Fraser empire. The rage in my chest was a live wire, sparking with every breath, but I channeled it into focus. I was Captain Lauren Mackenzie, forged in the crucible of war, and I wasn't going to let their lies bury the truth. The USB was a start, but I needed more, irrefutable proof to bring their house of cards crashing down. My training kicked in, the instincts honed in Afghanistan's dust-choked valleys guiding my next move. Olivia, with her lawyer's arrogance, was the key. She was too meticulous, too controlling to leave evidence lying around unsecured. Her iPad, always clutched like a shield, was my target. I waited for the storm to peak, the snow falling in thick sheets that would erase my tracks. At 2 a.m., I drove the Silverado back to the Fraser family's West Vancouver mansion, 120 kilometers south, its looming silhouette barely visible through the whiteout. The security system was a joke, some off-the-shelf model designed for suburban break-ins, not a Canadian Forces Ranger with a mission. I moved like a ghost, my breath steady, my boots silent on the snow-dusted driveway. The side entrance, hidden behind a row of cedars, gave way with a pick and a flick of my wrist. Inside, the mansion was a tomb of opulence, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and wealth. The study was exactly as I remembered, cedar-paneled, with a mahogany desk that screamed Edward Fraser's ego. Olivia's iPad sat charging, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. I powered it on, my heart pounding but my hands steady. Her password? I took a calculated guess, banking on her predictable vanity. I typed in the birthdate of a tech mogul she'd been cozying up to at Vancouver galas, March 15, 1987. The screen unlocked on the first try. I bit back a bitter laugh. Typical Olivia. I plugged in my encrypted drive and initiated a full data clone, the progress bar crawling as I stood watch, every creak of the house spiking my adrenaline. 10 minutes later, I was out, melting back into the storm, the cloned data burning a hole in my pocket. Back in the cabin, I sent the files to Ryan Mitchell, my old signals intelligence specialist, now a cybersecurity guru in Toronto. His response came within hours, his voice crackling over a secure line. "Lauren, this is a goldmine," he said, his tone sharp with urgency. "You've got a draft will, created 2 days before Alistair's death, timestamped at 11:43 p.m. on a night when medical records show he was sedated, incapable of signing anything." My blood ran cold. The file wasn't just a will, it was a forgery, naming Olivia and Ethan as sole heirs. Then Ryan dropped the bombshell. "There's a voicemail, too. From James Carter, their lawyer. Listen to this." I clicked play, and James's voice, panicked and frayed, filled the cabin. "Olivia, this is wrong. It's illegal. If Edward finds out, or God forbid, Lauren, we're done. I told you, no more tampering with the will." The timestamp, 8:17 p.m., the night before the forged will was finalized, was a dagger to the heart. James, the man who'd read Alistair's will with trembling hands, was complicit but cracking under the guilt. Ryan wasn't done. "There's more," he said. Pacific Ventures, a shell company tied to Olivia, siphoned off $1.2 million from the Fraser family trust in the last 6 months. The transfers line up with Ethan's campaign contributions to a Vancouver city councillor. "They're playing dirty, Lauren." I leaned back, the weight of the evidence pressing against my ribs like a loaded rucksack. This wasn't just greed, it was a calculated conspiracy, a betrayal so vile it made my skin crawl. Olivia and Ethan hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd weaponized Alistair's legacy for their own corrupt games. I clenched my fists, the rage now a controlled burn, fueling my resolve. "Keep digging, Ryan," I said, my voice low, lethal. "We're not stopping until they're exposed." The USB had been the spark. This data was the fuse. And I was ready to light it. The storm had passed, leaving Vancouver streets slick and gleaming under the sodium glow of streetlights. I sat in the 1985 Chevrolet Silverado, the weight of General Alistair Fraser's USB drive heavy in my pocket, its damning audio file and the cloned data from Olivia Bennett's iPad burning a hole in my resolve. My family, Edward Fraser, Margaret, Olivia, and her venomous husband Ethan, thought they'd buried me with their betrayal, handing me a rusted truck while they claimed the Fraser empire. But the evidence I'd uncovered with Ryan Mitchell's help, a forged will, a panicked voicemail from their lawyer James Carter, and a shell company siphoning millions, was a loaded weapon, and I was ready to fire. When Olivia's text arrived, inviting me to dinner at a chic downtown Vancouver restaurant, I knew it wasn't about reconciliation. It was a reconnaissance mission, a chance to gauge my threat level. I accepted, not out of hope, but because every soldier knows you never pass up a chance to gather intel on the enemy. The restaurant, perched on the edge of Cole Harbor, was all glass and low lighting, the kind of place where a single glass of Okanagan Valley Pinot Noir costs more than a week's groceries. The air smelled of seared salmon and pretension, the clink of cutlery a stark contrast to the war raging inside me. Edward sat at the head of the table, his tailored suit as unyielding as his CEO persona, dissecting a steak with surgical precision. Margaret, her hands nervously smoothing her silk scarf, stared at her untouched plate, avoiding my gaze. Olivia, in a sleek black dress, exuded the polished confidence of a lawyer who'd never lost a case. Ethan, his cufflinks glinting under the chandelier, swirled a glass of wine with a smirk that begged to be wiped off. They were a tableau of privilege, their wealth a shield they thought impenetrable. I sat across from them in a plain black sweater, my posture rigid, a soldier in enemy territory. Olivia broke the silence, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Lauren, I was worried about you, out there in that cabin," she said, her eyes flicking over me like I was a case file. "I was with Granddad in his final days, you know." I read to him, held his hand. It was so hard, seeing him so frail. The lie was a blade, sharp and deliberate. I knew from Alistair's medical records, obtained through Ryan's contacts, that he'd been heavily sedated, unresponsive in his final week at Vancouver General Hospital. My grip tightened on my water glass, but my face remained a mask of calm, a discipline forged in fire. Edward launched into a monologue about a $50 million condo deal in Yaletown, his voice booming with self-importance. Ethan chimed in, boasting about their upcoming ski trip to Banff, where you don't see just anybody, his eyes daring me to react. They were marking their territory, reminding me I didn't belong. I waited, letting their arrogance fill the air, my training keeping my pulse steady. Then, during a lull, I struck. "The truck's not the issue," I said, my voice cutting through the clatter of the restaurant like a sniper's shot. "The issue is that Granddad's will was changed." The effect was electric. Edward's fork froze mid-air, a drop of sauce dripping onto the pristine tablecloth. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something like fear. Olivia's smile stiffened, her lawyer's composure cracking for a split second. Ethan leaned forward, his smirk twisting into a sneer. "What's that supposed to mean, soldier?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think you're entitled to more than a rust bucket? Stick to your army games." I met his gaze, my eyes cold as the Pacific in winter. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, each word a promise. As we left, my phone pinged with an email from Olivia's law firm, its subject line chillingly formal, Estate of Alistair Fraser. It offered me 5,000 Canadian dollars to sign away my claim to the estate, a final, insulting slap. The rage flared, white hot, but I didn't break. I forwarded the email to Ryan, my voice steady over the secure line. "They're scared," I said. "Keep digging." The dinner wasn't a truce, it was their first mistake. And I was ready to exploit it. The Whistler cabin was a frozen cocoon, the wind outside howling like a wounded animal as I sat at the rickety wooden table, staring at the email from Olivia Bennett's law firm. The subject line, Estate of Alistair Fraser, was a sterile mask for the venom within. My family, Edward Fraser, Margaret, Olivia, and her conniving husband Ethan, had offered me 5,000 Canadian dollars to sign away any claim to my grandfather's legacy, a paltry sum that wouldn't cover a month's rent in Vancouver. The words on the screen weren't just an offer, they were a calculated insult, a final attempt to erase me from the Fraser name. My hands trembled, not with fear but with a rage so raw it felt like my bones were cracking. The betrayal in that Cole Harbour restaurant, where Olivia's lies about being at Alistair's bedside had cut me deep, was nothing compared to this. This was the moment I realized they didn't just want my inheritance, they wanted my silence, my surrender, my very existence wiped clean. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the worn floorboards, and paced the cabin's 20-square-meter interior. The rage was a living thing, clawing up my throat, but beneath it was a deeper wound, one that dragged me back to a memory I'd buried like a landmine. I was 18, standing in the West Vancouver mansion's marble foyer, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, ready to leave for Canadian Forces basic training in Chilliwack, 100 kilometers east. I'd hoped for a goodbye, maybe a shred of pride from my parents for choosing a path of service. Instead, Edward Fraser, his face a storm cloud, had towered over me. "You're abandoning this family for some grunt's life," he'd spat, his voice echoing off the chandelier. "Go, but don't expect us to welcome you back." Margaret stood behind him, her eyes red but her lips sealed, her silence louder than his anger. I'd waited for her to speak, to defend me, to say anything. She'd promised me once, when I was 12 and crying after Edward mocked my love for Alistair's war stories, that she'd always have my back. "You're my daughter, Lauren," she'd whispered, her hands soft on my cheek. But that day, as I walked out the door, she turned away, choosing Edward's wrath over her own daughter. The memory was a knife, twisting deeper now as I realized she'd known about the will and done nothing. The pain was suffocating, but it wasn't the end. My phone buzzed, shattering the cabin's silence. It was Ryan Mitchell, my old comrade from Toronto, his voice tight with urgency over the secure line. "Lauren, I've got something," he said. Pacific Ventures, Olivia's shell company, didn't just siphon $1.2 million from the Fraser Trust. They funneled 300,000 Canadian dollars into Ethan's campaign donations for a Vancouver City Councillor's re-election bid. It's not just fraud, it's political corruption, tied to a numbered account in the Caymans. I froze, my breath catching. This wasn't just about stealing my inheritance. Olivia and Ethan were using Alistair's legacy to buy influence, to grease palms in Vancouver's political machine. The betrayal was complete, a violation so vile it felt like they'd spat on my grandfather's grave. "They're not just greedy," I said, my voice a low growl. "They're desecrating everything he stood for." Ryan's response was immediate, his tone as steady as a sniper's aim. "We've got enough to bury them, Captain. Say the word." I stood at the cabin's window, the snow piling up outside like the weight of my family's lies. The 5,000 Canadian dollars offer wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. I saved the email, printed it, and tucked it into a folder I labeled Operation Truth. The pain of Margaret's silence, Edward's rejection, and Olivia's corruption fused with the fire in my chest, forging something unbreakable. "Keep the line open, Ryan," I said, my voice steady, lethal. "We're going to war." They thought they could by my silence, erase my honor. They were wrong. I wasn't just Alistair's granddaughter, I was his soldier, and I'd fight for his truth until my last breath. The Vancouver courthouse loomed like a fortress of justice, its granite walls cold and unyielding under the grey British Columbia sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the weight of consequence, a battlefield where truth would either triumph or be buried. I, Captain Lauren Mackenzie, sat beside my lawyer, Sophie Nguyen, my posture as rigid as if I were facing a firing squad. My family, Edward Fraser, Margaret, Olivia Bennett, and her scheming husband Ethan, sat across the aisle, their faces a mask of polished arrogance. They believed their wealth, their Fraser empire, made them untouchable. But the evidence I'd uncovered, General Alistair Fraser's audio file, James Carter's panicked voicemail, the forged will, and the corrupt dealings of Olivia's Pacific Ventures, was a loaded rifle, and I was about to pull the trigger. The rage that had burned since they threw those rusted Chevrolet Silverado keys at me was now a controlled blaze, guiding every move in this war for my grandfather's honor. Sophie Nguyen, a young Vancouver lawyer with eyes like a hawk and a reputation for tearing through corporate lies, stood with the calm of a seasoned soldier. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and piercing, "we're here to expose a fraud that defiled the legacy of General Alistair Fraser." Olivia's lawyer, Richard Lang, a silver-haired veteran of British Columbia's elite law circles, shot to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is making baseless accusations." Sophie didn't flinch. "I'll substantiate every word, Your Honor," she said, her tone as sharp as a bayonet. She clicked a key on her laptop, and Alistair's voice filled the courtroom, frail but resolute. "This is not what I agreed to. I will not change my will now." A murmur rippled through the gallery, like a stone dropped in still water. Olivia's perfect composure cracked, her manicured fingers gripping the table's edge. Edward's jaw tightened, his CEO facade faltering. Margaret stared at her lap, her hands trembling. Sophie pressed on, relentless. "Exhibit B, Your Honor." James Carter's voicemail played, his voice a ragged whisper of guilt. "Olivia, this is illegal. If Edward finds out, or Lauren, we're done. No more tampering." The timestamp, 8:17 p.m., the night before the forged will was filed, hung in the air like a guillotine. James, seated in the back, shrank into his chair, his face ashen. Richard Lang objected again, his voice strained. "Provenance unverified. This could be fabricated." Sophie's smile was cold, predatory. "Then let's move to Exhibit C." A screen lit up with the forged will's metadata, showing it was created at 11:43 p.m., 2 days before Alistair's death, when he was sedated in Vancouver General Hospital, 10 kilometers away. General Fraser was legally incapacitated, Sophie said. "This document is a lie." The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the tension so thick it pressed against my chest. Sophie wasn't done. "Exhibit D," she announced, displaying a spreadsheet tracking 1.2 million Canadian dollars flowing from the Fraser Trust to Pacific Ventures, Olivia's shell company, with 300,000 Canadian dollars funneled to Ethan's political donations. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Ethan's smirk vanished, his eyes darting to Olivia, who sat frozen, her face pale as the snow outside. Edward's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "Finally, Exhibit E," Sophie said, her voice ringing with righteous fury. She read the email offering me 5,000 Canadian dollars to abandon my claim, her words dripping with contempt. They tried to buy Captain Mackenzie's silence, to erase her honor with pocket change. Judge Eleanor Chen leaned forward, her eyes like chips of obsidian, sweeping over my family's crumbling fortress. "This court has heard compelling evidence of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy," she said, her voice steady but heavy with authority. "I order an immediate freeze on all Fraser estate assets, pending a full investigation by the British Columbia Attorney General's office." The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Olivia's head bowed, her lawyer whispering frantically. Ethan stared at the floor, his bravado gone. Edward's face was a mask of defeat, his empire trembling. I felt no joy, only a hollow relief. The truth had spoken, but the war wasn't over, it was just shifting to a new front. The Vancouver courthouse faded into the rearview mirror of my 1985 Chevrolet Silverado, its engine now purring smoothly after a rebuild funded by a small savings account my grandfather, General Alistair Fraser, had hidden for me. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming cherry blossoms and the promise of renewal as I drove through British Columbia's winding mountain roads, the coastal range rising like silent sentinels. The war was over. The truth had torn through the Fraser family's lies, Edward Fraser's empire, Margaret's silence, Olivia Bennett's fraud, and Ethan's corruption exposed in a courtroom 10 kilometers from their West Vancouver mansion. The judge's gavel had frozen their assets, and the British Columbia Attorney General's investigation loomed like a storm cloud. But as I gripped the steering wheel, the weight of victory felt hollow, a quiet ache where triumph should have been. This fight, against my father's disdain, my mother's betrayal, my sister's greed, was never about the money. It was about honor, Alistair's honor, and mine. In Sophie Nguyen's small office above a gastown coffee shop, I made my decision. The original will, uncovered through a fingerprint-locked safe in the Silverado's glove compartment, restored my one-third share of the Fraser estate, millions in assets, from the Okanagan Lake House to shares in Fraser Enterprises. But as Sophie slid the documents across her desk, her sharp eyes studying me, I knew what I had to do. Draft one more paper, I told her, my voice steady, resolute. I'm transferring my entire share to a new foundation. Sophie paused, her pen hovering. You're sure, Lauren? She asked, her tone soft but searching. I nodded, a peace I hadn't felt in years settling over me. It's not mine to keep. It's his legacy. The General Alistair Fraser Honour Scholarship Fund was born that day, dedicated to funding education for children of Canadian Forces veterans and fallen soldiers across Canada. Every cent, every dollar of the estate I could have claimed, went to those who'd earned it through sacrifice, not greed. I hit the road in the Silverado, its fresh leather seats a quiet nod to Alistair's memory, heading east toward the Rockies with no destination pinned on a map. The open highway stretched before me, 4,000 kilometers of possibility from British Columbia to the Atlantic. I'd spent my life running, from Edward's scorn, Margaret's silence, Olivia's schemes. Now, I was running towards something, freedom. Alistair taught me that honor isn't inherited, it's built, brick by brick, through choices that define you. I chose to fight, not for wealth, but for truth. I chose to honor the man who saw me when no one else did. Here's what I learned. First, your strength comes from within. When the world turns its back, you can still stand tall. Second, justice isn't a gift, it's a battle you wage with every ounce of your will. Third, family isn't just blood, it's the people who run toward you in the dark, like Ryan Mitchell and Sophie Nguyen, who fought beside me when my own kin left me to bleed. This is my story, but it's not the only one. If you've ever fought for what's right, faced betrayal, or found strength in your own honor, I want to hear from you. Join me at True North Courage. Share your story in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if this journey moved you. Let's build a community that stands for truth, for honor, for the courage to keep going. I'm Captain Lauren Mackenzie, and I'm just getting started.